video of a VIP arriving and a traffic jam, and it was beautifully done and the music was beautiful and I was like weeping, and I completely bought into the melodrama of the whole piece, which doesn't exist in my piece at all, because it's sort of a very dry video where nothing really happens. But in the video that actually went out to the mass public, I don't know if all of you have seen this video, but it's basically just about a city that's waiting for a VIP to drive by. So it's a process of it's sort of a turn of waiting. But in that video, in the music video, everyone gets out, everyone walks and they put their hands up and they stop the VIP motorcade from driving by. It was very sort of dramatic, melodramatic, and there's somebody dying in the ambulance and things like that. But of course, it was very interesting to see how a sort of imagery created by an artist was taken 2 steps further, and I think it was quite flattering. But you know, this is just a small instance of how things may carry.
But you know, I want to take the 3 things you mentioned: impact, the question of seclusion, and
the legibility within the work itself.
I think we need to think about the question of impact a little differently. I have never believed that art can change the world. I don't think that anything can change the world other than the actions that people undertake to incrementally, the incremental effect of millions of people trying to change their circumstances, and sometimes together, sometimes in self-solidarity, sometimes through random and exceptional acts that stand out and then become markers for others to follow. I mean, given an example that we have seen over the last year, something change in our neighborhood in Iran, right? Something changed forever in Iran in the last year. And that didn't happen because artists were doing it. Artists had to follow the change that occurred in Iran. And I think that it's one of those instances where, because we in South Asia are so self-centered that we never look beyond our particular paradigm, something changed fundamentally in our neighborhood. And of course we never bothered, but most of us never bothered. Point, however, is that there are things that I think, when we talk about impact, if we were able to measure certain other things, then perhaps it would be different. What I find really interesting about in your video is that ultimately it's about waiting and time. It's about the time taken to wait for history to pass you by, right? Now, the very fact that we can actually situate that as a political question is for me pretty significant, right? Or that in your other work, which is about security devices, and we talked about this before, that there is an almost delicate, loving precision with which you render the intercoms and security devices that are filters between the crowd, the street, and the homes of those who need protection. That this question of what you speak into and what you are heard is rendered with this kind of precision. Now, acts of speaking, acts of surveillance, acts of waiting, acts of time, acts of inhabiting duration. For me, these are very, very important political questions. In fact, they're actually far more important political questions than the incidental obscenity of a communal riot. Right? Because communal riots come and go and they change their character, and people die and people are killed. But there is something that the regulation of time in our lives actually changes the nature of life itself, right? Changes the nature of the inhabitation of the area. So I have forever been irritated by the fact that in this part of the world, artists respond with such great alacrity to newspaper headlines about sectarian violence, and with so little patience to the question of time in our lives, which for me is actually a substantive, deeper, more fundamental political question. And so if by the insertion of these works into spaces, even if they are of seclusion, they can alter the character of our political imaginations by insisting that these are things that we think about with some consideration, then I think we're doing something. if, for instance, in Naeem's work, there is this question, this ironic, somewhat self-deprecating register that you use about the witness position that you have, about the convergence and divergence of style, of the style of politics between a so-called Islamist rally and a so-called leftist rally. The patterns of inclusion and exclusion often mirror each other in incredible ways. I mean, I've always insisted that the left and right in this country are, as, I mean, I don't know how categorically one would say it in Bangladesh or Pakistan, but they do in fact mirror each other in terms of style. And if we were to talk about style as a political question, then I think that we are making a substantive contribution to adding depth to political discourse, which usually ends up being a morbid game of, you know, who is a greater victim. And a lot of political art is about the rendition of victimhood. It's about the rendition of suffering as a condition that can be used to extract a certain kind of value. And I think, and I know I'm sort of putting myself out of line here, but that is really cheap. Because more often than not, the artist does not have to suffer. And the usage of suffering as the currency of meaning,
including in the artist's biography.
Including in the artist's biography, is for me something that I would have an ethical objection. If the artist can put themselves on the line on questions that are actually part of the conversation of themselves in daily life, it's a different matter. I have had to work, for instance, I know that, you know, we've had art against communalism, art against terrorism. I don't see how these are necessarily divergent terms. Lots of acts of terrorism are also works of art. I mean, Stockhausen got really hauled up for saying that September 11th was a work of art. I think it is a work of art. Now, the question is not whether you're for or against that work of art, but you have to understand that September 11th was an act, among other things, of architectural criticism.
That's the thing.
And it doesn't make it less serious to say so, right? It doesn't make it less ethically culpable to say so. So when I hear art against communalism, I'm saying, what about all those, you know, wonderful expressions of artistic activity that are massacres, or that are pogroms? I mean, are we saying that the aesthetic is an innocent category? I mean, people really go to war because of the music that they hear. You know? People really go to war because of the design of the flags that are flown. These are aesthetic questions, and why should we even pretend that this realm of the aesthetic has some kind of innocence? We left that, you know, people no longer say that to be a physicist is to be innocent of the destiny of nuclear weapons. Why should any fool think that by being an artist you make yourself innocent? You're probably much more culpable, right? And as somebody who has had, for various accidental personal reasons, to deal a lot quite seriously with questions of terrorism in the life and death of individuals, I know very well that that it would be extremely difficult as a person, because I have been unfortunately involved in close relationships to spectacular terrorist trials, which have changed the course of this country. India and Pakistan nearly went to war because a friend of mine was framed for 5 years in a terrorism case, which is the 13th December trial. Right? I mean, public memory is short, but our armies were facing each other. And it all hinged on the statements that could be extracted or not extracted from someone who I happen to know very well. Right? So, I mean, and this is a part of my life, and it's something that I've had to think about a lot. I will hesitate a million times before that reality enters the processual, circulation of artwork. It may enter my attitudes, it may enter my understanding of the world, but I would never be able to process that into something that I can make into into one object, it will probably inhabit the rest of my life. You know, and that's what makes me shudder sometimes when I see art against communalism or art against.
But you did choose to make work about that in the sense of the really long essay you wrote. You don't define that as work in the same way.
No,
that was an anthology.
Well, I mean, that brings us back to this question of the double registers one occupies. But there are things that I will do because it is necessary for them to be done in a portrait.